Hey guys, tonight we're going behind the heavy wooden doors of a medieval convent where the scent of beeswax mingles with incense and the stone corridors echo not with silence but with secrets. You'll hear the rustle of veils as dozens of women cloistered from the world go about lives stranger than fiction, and often not so holy. You might think becoming a nun meant peaceful prayer and modest soup. But what if I told you some of these women faked visions to get extra cheese, that they smuggled love letters and psalm books, plotted escape on feast days, and held midnight exorcisms that involved livestock? If this glimpse behind convent walls already has you intrigued, show some love. Tap like subscribe and join our little corner of the curious. And if you're watching this under the covers, like I know some of you do, drop your time zone and location in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But what really happened behind those cloistered walls? The truth might just rewrite everything you thought you knew about nuns. Imagine being 13 and sent away forever, with no choice, no goodbye, and no idea what lies beyond the convent gate. You feel the crunch of gravel under your boots as you approach the outer walls. The air smells of damp wood and yesterday's ashes. The year is 1329, and you're escorting your cousin, just 13 years old, toward the entrance of St. Wiberata's convent, perched on the edge of a sleepy fog-soaked valley. She clutches her new prayer book tightly. You're wondering why she looks more terrified than blessed. Was the convent a holy sanctuary, or a prison wrapped in psalms and stone? The truth is, she didn't choose this life. Most girls didn't. In noble families, younger daughters were often offered to convents. Translation: shipped off to religious institutions in lieu of expensive marriage dowries. It's cheaper to give God your child than give her a castle. And once that gate closes behind her, it won't open again for years, maybe ever. The abbess, robed in worn wool and authority, greets you with practiced warmth. She barely glances at your cousin before ushering her in. Behind the wall, the convent breathes like a separate world, part sacred retreat, part social prison. You're not even sure if she's scared because of the unknown or because of what she already knows. Inside, everything is colder. The stone halls amplify each step. Candles flicker inside narrow niches, their wax pooling like sleepy waterfalls. The first night in the convent is the hardest, they say, but they also say the second night is worse because that's when it sinks in you're not going home. Your cousin is led to a dormitory shared by a dozen others. The straw mattress smells faintly of mildew, and the girl beside her whispers something about the abbess's evil eye when she's annoyed. There's no bedtime story, no kiss goodnight, just a whispered prayer, and the knowledge that tomorrow begins before sunrise. Outside, the bells toll. Compline, the last prayer of the day. But sleep comes slowly, interrupted by the creak of shifting wood beams and the occasional cough. You imagine her lying there, eyes wide open, wondering whether she's now a bride of Christ or a prisoner with better hymns. What does sacred duty really look like for a teenage novice? Spoiler, it's colder and quieter than you think. By the next morning, she's been given a task. All novices are. Hers scraping candle wax off choir benches. A sacred duty, they tell her. But sacred doesn't mean glamorous. Later, she'll be taught how to sing Gregorian chants in Latin, which she doesn't understand, and embroider altar cloths for festivals she won't attend. But before that breakfast, a bowl of thin, barley gruel, served lukewarm in total silence. Silence is the convent's great ritual. Not just quiet, strict, choreographed non-speech. The women speak through hand signs and lowered eyes. Some nuns go months without hearing their own voice aloud. It's meant to bring them closer to God, but really, it brings them closer to the strange hum of their own thoughts. Even in silence, secrets find a way to laugh. So how did the nuns survive the monotony with music mischief and coded glances? Still, not everything is joyless. There's a secret smile shared between two sisters over the herb garden fence. A game of accidentally mixing up slippers in the cloister. And always there's music. The sisters sing not just to worship, but to survive the monotony. The echo of chant in a stone chapel is one of the few beauties they're allowed. Of course, not everyone adapts. Some girls cry each night for weeks. Others get creative. There are whispered tales of one nun who faked a ghost sighting just to get reassigned to the library where it was warmer. Historians still argue whether that haunting was real or a brilliant con with good lighting. As evening falls again, your cousin now knows her way from the dorm to the refectory and back. She's memorized the bell schedule. She's figured out which sister always sneaks an extra apple. She's even started to walk like the others, slow, deliberate arms tucked. But she hasn't smiled yet. That it seems will take longer. And just like that, she is part of this place. One pale face among dozens. Another girl who knows too much too soon. About vows she hasn't made, prayers she doesn't feel, and freedoms she may never reclaim. The bells toll matins before dawn. You wake to the slow rising of hymns in the darkness, the kind that seems stitched together from breath and cold stone. The convent is already stirring, and your cousin, still bleary-eyed, still adjusting, is about to learn how vows are made and debts are dodged. It starts with a dowry. You might imagine that when a girl becomes a nun, she's escaping the burdens of marriage and children. But in the medieval world, becoming a bride of Christ didn't come cheap. Families were still expected to pay a dowry less than a noble wedding, but substantial enough to feel like a price tag on piety. For many fathers, this was a cost-saving strategy. Rather than marry off 5 daughters, they'd choose one heir wed her to a neighboring baron and send the rest off to various convents. Peaceful, contained, and much more affordable. Your cousin, like so many before her, has been settled. It sounds tidy, like a ledger entry, and in some ways, it is. The abbess keeps careful records. She knows who paid full dowry, who negotiated in chickens, and which families offered a nice tapestry in lieu of silver. These offerings don't buy favor exactly, but they do buy placement. A wealthier novice might get warmer boots, more time in the scriptorium, or a mentor who actually likes mentoring. Your cousin, whose dowry consisted of some coin, a jug of honey, and 3 yards of uncut wool, will need to earn her status the hard way. Think vows are just words. In medieval convents, they were currency, and not everyone paid in silver. Not all the girls come from noble bloodlines. Some were orphans sponsored by bishops. Others were children of merchants who bought piety with profit. But there's a visible pecking order. You can see it in the dining line, where the richest nuns get served first, and in the choir loft, where the front seats are unofficially reserved for those with connections. Promised to God before birth, some girls were never given a chance to choose their path. But that didn't stop rebellion. And then there are the lifers. These are the girls who were promised to the convent before they were even born, offered in prayer by mothers desperate to survive childbirth, or fathers begging for better harvests. Some of them wear their fate with serene pride, others less so. One novice, they whisper, tried to escape by climbing the garden wall dressed as a traveling minstrel. She made it all the way to the bakery in the next village before she was caught, mostly because she wouldn't stop correcting their Latin. You see, vows don't happen immediately. Your cousin is now in a liminal state, a novice. She wears a white veil, a symbol of transition. Only after a year, or sometimes 3, will she take permanent vows and don the full habit. In theory, this delay is to allow time for reflection. In reality, it's also a test. Can she follow the rules? Keep the silence, wake up for prayers, and avoid falling asleep during vigil. The abbess likes to quote Saint Benedict, to prefer nothing to the love of Christ. But your cousin, if she's honest, currently prefers warm socks, a hot bath, and not being stared at by the relic of Saint Aldegond every time she eats. Becoming a bride of Christ wasn't just spiritual, it was theatrical, political, and deeply personal. The ceremony of vows, when it comes, is dramatic. Candles line the chapel floor. The novice lies prostrate on the cold stone arms spread like a cross. She recites her oath in Latin, though half of it she doesn't understand. She is given a new name, Sister Beatrix, perhaps symbolizing rebirth into a life of chastity, obedience, and poverty. But poverty is relative. Some sisters manage to hold on to family gifts, silver hairpins, embroidered pouches, even poetry books hidden in straw mattresses. There's a reason many convents eventually had to ban personal luxuries, because nothing undermines holy poverty like an imported saffron scarf or a secretly sweetened bowl of gruel. And what about obedience? Well, it depends on the nun. Some take to it like ducks to holy water. Others find loopholes. They write their own prayers, hide contraband pastries, and feign illness to skip Mass. One even forged permission slips from the bishop until she was caught when he visited in person and noticed she'd approved her own feast day. Historians still argue whether such minor rebellions were common or exaggerated by scandalous letters from disgruntled monks. Either way, records show plenty of nuns had personalities that didn't quite match their vows. Forget what you think you know about abbesses. This one rules like a queen with a prayer book in one hand and a penance list in the other. Meanwhile, the abbess remains the undisputed ruler of this tiny kingdom. She settles disputes, assigns chores, and mediates drama with the calm authority of someone who's seen 5 generations of novices cry on laundry day. Don't let the rosary fool you. She's a politician, judge, therapist, and treasurer, all rolled into one. If you cross, her penance might involve scrubbing candle wax for a month with your non-dominant hand. And yet, in all this there's a rhythm, a strange, soothing regularity. Morning bells, silent meals, garden work, choir rehearsals. Even your cousin starts to find comfort in the structure. It beats the chaos of a noble household or the fear of childbirth at 14. As the week closes, she's no longer the newest girl in the dorm. Another arrives confused, clutching her blanket eyes, scanning the stone arches for comfort. Your cousin offers her half a pair. It's not much, but in this place, it's practically a miracle. The first time you wake up in a convent dormitory, it feels like you've been swallowed by stone. Cold air creeps down from the arched ceiling. The only sound is the slow, synchronized rustling of linen as 24 sisters rise, wrap themselves in cloaks, and begin another silent shuffle toward the chapel. It's still hours before sunrise. Not so silent nights indeed. They call them vigils, midnight prayers meant to keep the spirit alert and the body humble. In theory, it's a sacred routine. In practice, it's a room full of half-sleeping women trying not to trip over their own habits in the dark. Some carry candles, others navigate by memory. The more experienced ones could probably make it blindfolded. Your cousin, still new to the routine, clutches her tiny taper as if it's a torch, guiding her through the underworld. The wax drips on her fingers, but she doesn't flinch. She's already learned that the first rule of convent life: don't complain. Not allowed anyway. The chapel at night is a different world. Flickering candles cast long shadows across the wooden choir stalls. You sit, or rather kneel on a narrow bench, polished smooth by decades of tired knees. The chant begins. Latin syllables float through the air, soft as snow. Half the sisters aren't awake enough to pronounce the words properly. One even hiccups mid-psalm. No one reacts. You'd expect all this silence to feel peaceful. Sometimes it is. Other times it's heavy. You begin to notice the little rebellions: a sister who sings off key on purpose, another who pretends to faint to get out of extra prayer sessions. One legendary nun, they say, used to fake nosebleeds during Lent just to sneak into the herb room for a sip of honey water. Historians still argue whether these disruptions were acts of resistance or simply the symptoms of cabin fever. But from inside the cloister, it's hard to tell the difference. By day, the convent has its order. By night, it has its own rituals, some sanctioned, others secret. After Compline, when the final prayers are said, the nuns return to their dormitory. But not all go straight to sleep. There are whispers, tiny murmurs under linen hoods, a question about home, a laugh stifled under the covers. Sister Colette, the one with the squeaky shoes, always tells a riddle before sleep. Tonight's is about a bishop, a barrel of eels, and an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a fish hook. You don't get it, but the others chuckle silently. The abbess has warned against idle talk, but idle talk is survival. It's how you stay human. One novice writes notes under her blanket, tiny letters on scraps of vellum. She claims they're poems, but someone suspects they're love letters, though no one knows to whom. Another sister sharpens her embroidery needle against the window ledge. Just a habit, she says, but it makes people nervous, especially since she once pricked Sister Agnes during a dispute over ink. Then there are the dreams. Your cousin begins to have them regularly. Nuns on fire, a staircase that leads to a feast she can never reach, a voice that speaks only in birdsong. She doesn't mention them, but the dark circles under her eyes tell their own tale. Sleep in the convent isn't exactly restful. The mattresses are thin, the room is drafty, and the bells come too often. Still they manage. The body adapts, the mind somewhat, the soul. That's the tricky part, because somewhere between matins and lauds, in the blurred hours before morning, even the most devoted sister begins to wonder, is this what holiness feels like, or just exhaustion? The nights stretch long in winter. Snow muffles the outside world. The windows frost over in delicate filigree like accidental stained glass. You'd think the convent would grow quiet, but instead it hums low, constant, like a building that's forgotten how to sleep. One evening, a storm knocks out the bell mechanism. For 6 hours, no one knows when to pray. Chaos ensues. Sister Mathilde insists it's already terse. The abbess disagrees. Two novices argue over candle placement, and one accidentally sets her sleeve on fire. No one is hurt, but it becomes a legendary story, retold every year at Epiphany, with increasing dramatic flair. Afterward, the bell is repaired, routine resumes, but something has shifted. For the first time, your cousin realizes how much of convent life depends on the structure of time. Remove that, and it all unravels like a poorly sewn hem. Yet through all of it, the sleepless nights, the freezing fingers, the chanting that blurs into dreams, there are moments of strange beauty. One sister paints stars on her prayer book margins. Another sneaks peppermint oil into the dormitory for sore feet. Sister Beatrix starts humming lullabies in the hallway soft enough not to count as speech, but loud enough to soothe the girls who can't sleep. Because in the end, everyone's tired. And even holiness, it seems, needs a bedtime. Forbidden books, hidden staircases, and a secret room that could unravel centuries of silence. There's a door at the back of the convent library that sticks slightly when it rains. If you pull it just right, slow and angled, it makes an almost no noise at all. Beyond it, a narrow staircase winds up into a little room, tucked behind the chapel's bell tower. It's dusty, forgotten. Perfect. That's where your cousin finds the books. Not the usual kind, not sermons or saints' lives or rules about how much fish is too much fish during a fast. These books are older bound in cracked leather and smelling of sage. Some don't even have covers, just scraps of writing in curling Latin and old French tucked between fading bits of parchment. And some shouldn't be here at all. Forbidden books, hidden thoughts. It starts with curiosity. After all, what's a girl to do when she's been told for years that knowledge is dangerous, that too much reading leads to pride, that silence is safer? She reads, one book is a bestiary with creatures the church does not endorse, unicorns, manticores, women who turn into trees. Another is filled with herbal recipes, written in the hand of a nun long dead. Most are harmless, but a few pages contain diagrams, symbols, marginal notes about dreams and stars, and the power of fennel beneath a waning moon. This isn't mere superstition. This is forbidden knowledge, not because it's evil, but because it's unsanctioned. It hasn't passed through a bishop's hands. No monk has blessed it. That makes it dangerous. Your cousin reads anyway. By candlelight, her world widens. She learns that Hildegard of Bingen composed music no one else could hear, that Julian of Norwich wrote of a God who was mother as much as father, that some women saw visions not because they were saints, but because they were clever and trapped, and dreams were the only escape. Historians still argue whether these writings were tolerated in some convents or always hidden. What's certain is that many nuns knew more than they let on. Sister Melisenda, for instance, is an expert in scriptorium rotation, who's assigned when and which corners the prioress never checks. She teaches your cousin to copy texts in miniature script thin as spider silk. They practice by transcribing psalms, but occasionally slip in a line from Ovid, just for fun. And then there's the matter of language. Latin is the language of the Church, but Old French Occitan, even bits of Hebrew, those are different. Those are living, breathing languages passed between lips, not scrolls. Some nuns, former noblewomen, often bring these tongues with them. They become codes, hidden languages within the silence. One day, while rearranging hymnals, your cousin finds a tiny folded note stuck in the spine of a book. It's not addressed to anyone, just a line of verse barely legible, written in a flowing feminine hand. We speak in silence. Our books do not. She doesn't know who wrote it. Maybe no one does. But it feels like a message across time, a flicker of resistance pressed between pages. Of course, there are risks. The abbess occasionally inspects the library, looking for heresy and mouse droppings in equal measure. Once she confiscated a copy of Boethius, not because it was heretical, but because it made the novices too philosophical. Another time, she ordered the burning of a manuscript she claimed smelled of sulfur. It probably just had a mold problem. Still, the fear lingers. One wrong page, one suspicious margin, and the whole thing could vanish in smoke. So your cousin becomes clever. She hides pages inside the covers of sanctioned texts. She learns to re-sew bindings so the edges look untouched. She teaches others slowly, carefully. Not everyone is interested, but some are. A tiny sisterhood within the sisterhood, bound by ink and secrecy. One afternoon, the convent hosts a visiting bishop. He's large, red-cheeked, and mostly interested in inspecting the wine cellar. But during Vespers, he gives a speech about the dangers of idle minds, especially among women. He quotes Paul. He warns against feminine curiosity. He mispronounces Psalter. Your cousin listens, expression neutral. Later that night, she and Sister Melisenda write a parody of the bishop's sermon in the margins of a recipe book. It includes a joke about his hat and a footnote about his curious lack of neck. Rebellion in the convent is often quiet, but it is constant. And yet, it's not always resistance. Sometimes it's longing. A desire to understand, to learn to find meaning in a world that so often silences you. For every subversive poem or sly parody, there's also genuine wonder. A line of ancient verse that makes you feel seen. A diagram of stars that makes the cold chapel ceiling feel a little wider. Books in the convent are a form of freedom. Even the forbidden ones, especially the forbidden ones. Step through the convent's inner gate and you'll find it the walled garden. A small patch of tilled earth where order reigns. No tangled hedges or riotous flowers here. Just neat rows of herbs tended with the same care as a reliquary. It smells like thyme and wet wool, especially after rain, and it is far more than a place for prayerful strolls. This is the garden of many uses. By rule, the garden is for cultivating medicinals. That means plants with recognized healing properties: lavender for nerves, comfrey for bruises, fennel for digestion. It's also for penance. If you've been late to matins, you'll be weeding by sundown. Whispered during Lent time to trim nettles, your cousin quickly learns this truth in the convent. Every herb has two names. The official one, Latin clean approved, and the one the sisters actually use. Woundwort becomes plague bane. Rue becomes men's regret. Bethany is the headache's curse. She starts a notebook of her own disguised as a psalter. The margins fill up fast. Sister Imelda. The garden mistress is 73, smells of onions, and is possibly immortal. She claims she once cured a bishop's gout by wrapping his feet in boiled cabbage leaves and prayer. Your cousin suspects it was mostly cabbage. Still, Imelda knows things, what flowers the bees avoid, how to coax rosemary through a dry spell, and where to hide ginger root if the abbess is rationing it. The sisters make tinctures, teas, and salves. Most are innocuous. Some are not. There's a jar marked for stubborn digestion that also seems to induce sleep. Another labeled ointment for clarity is rumored to bring on visions, whether from divine inspiration or the generous use of belladonna, no one's quite sure. Historians still argue whether convent medicine was more mystical than medical, or whether it simply reflected the era's best guesses cloaked in liturgy. Occasionally, the garden is used for more than herbs. One summer, your cousin stumbles upon Sister Agnes burying something near the back wall. A dead bird, a relic, a love charm. She doesn't ask. Agnes just winks and pats the soil. Later, she claims it was a symbolic act to release envy into the earth. You never quite know with Agnes. Then there's the moonlit gathering. It's not a ritual per se. No chants, no circles. But every now and then, a few sisters sneak out just after Compline when the abbess is safely asleep and sit beneath the old hawthorn. They don't talk, they just sit. One might hum, another might pluck a few mint leaves. It's peaceful, rebellious only because it's unscheduled. Your cousin goes once. She doesn't understand the point at first, but by the time the bells ring prime and they slip back into the dormitory, she feels lighter. The garden is also where things are hidden. Old love tokens, brought from home worn rosaries, strung with beads from mother's bracelets, and even allegedly a smuggled letter from a monk in the next town. The letter's contents are unknown, but Sister Heloise keeps it sewn into the hem of her scapular, like a private relic. There's even a scarecrow nicknamed Saint Percival. He's missing an arm, wears a discarded wimple, and is annually redressed by the novices in increasingly outrageous garb. Once he sported a fake mitre made from old parchment. The abbess was not amused. Still, the garden is sacred, just not in the way the rule book describes. It's where sisters go to escape the echo of the stone chapel, the scraped silence of the dormitory. It's where laughter is safest, muffled by growing things, and where secrets grow faster than sage. In autumn, the leaves turn gold and brittle. The garden prepares for sleep. Sister Imelda blesses each plot with holy water, muttering something under her breath that may or may not be Latin. Your cousin watches the last of the calendula. Wilt feels the earth harden underfoot and realizes this too is a rhythm, not unlike prayer, not unlike rebellion. A few plants are harvested and dried for winter, sage, hyssop, chamomile. Others are left alone. The nettles, as always, return first in spring. By then, your cousin has a favored corner, a spot near the lavender where the sun hits just right after tierce. It's where she copies recipes, writes notes, sometimes dozes. The older sisters call it her station. The novices call it the dreaming spot. Everyone needs one. Love letters and psalm books, secret poetry and choir scrolls. Even nuns had their heartbreaks and hidden flames. Letters in the convent are a delicate matter. Technically, they're allowed with permission oversight and heavy editing. But Sister Ursula once received a letter from her brother in which he used the phrase carnal sin while describing a neighbor's gambling habits, and the abbess banned correspondence for a month. So naturally, the sisters found a workaround: sisterly scandals and love notes. It starts as these things often do with poetry. Harmless verses copied from books, passed in the margins of lesson papers. But eventually, the poetry becomes pointed, more personal. A line about moonlight on wool, another about eyes like river glass. Your cousin is careful, but she sees it all, especially after she's assigned to assist in the scriptorium, where such things occasionally slip between pages. One day, a psalter meant for the bishop arrives with a folded note inside, not from the copyist, from the illuminator. It reads in a fine italic, "The blue in your lapis work reminds me of the lake behind my old house. I hope the sisters let you see it again someday." There's no name, but the reply tucked into the ribbon of another manuscript weeks later is unmistakably returned to the same hand. Your cousin pretends not to notice, but the others do. Whispers ripple, and not just about that couple. Because it's not always love letters to monks or scribes. Sometimes it's from sister to sister. Historians still argue whether convent relationships were romantic, platonic, or spiritual unions beyond modern labels. The truth likely varies, but the records include more than a few curious incidents: pairs of nuns requesting joint burials, shared possessions, even poetic dedications hidden in church ledgers. The church officially disapproved. But as long as vows were kept, few convents pressed the issue unless things got out of hand, which sometimes they did. One infamous case involved Sister Ismene, who was caught meeting a young priest behind the south altar under the pretense of discussing choir acoustics. When questioned, she claimed the Holy Spirit had instructed her to investigate the curvature of masculine tones. The abbess reportedly sent her to the garden for 3 weeks of silence and excessive beet peeling. Another time, Sister Odelia began receiving small packages, figs, dried rose petals, even a carved whistle. The gifts were never traced, though suspicions pointed toward a merchant's son who delivered candles once a month and always lingered too long by the chapel door. When questioned, he claimed he was just checking the draft. The convent cracked down. Letters had to be reviewed. Deliveries were inspected. Quills were confiscated for mysterious reasons. And yet the notes still found their way through. Because the truth is, even cloistered life doesn't erase the heart. And the heart, when denied, grows creative. One sister stitched a message into the hem of her veil, just initials, but unmistakable to the right eyes. Another wrote her feelings into a set of Gregorian chant variations, assigning certain notes to hidden meanings. It was less a melody than a coded confession. Then came the case of the red ink. Your cousin hears it first from Sister Elfwin, who has a nose for gossip and a voice like an apologetic bell. A set of illuminated capital letters in a new manuscript appear unusually. Flushed, scarlet instead of carmine. The artist, Sister Apollonia, claims it's a new technique, but the hue just happens to match the ribbon worn by Sister Therese, whose eyes she watches just a little too long during choir. No one says a word. But for weeks, everyone turns to page 34, a little faster. Romance in the convent isn't declared. It's traced in glances, shared chores, moments stolen between prayers. It exists quietly like ivy, slow-growing stubborn, and sometimes blooming unexpectedly in the cracks. But it's not always sweet. Some notes are bitter. Confessions of jealousy, accusations of favoritism. One sister pens a 4-verse invective against another's bad habit of hoarding bathwater. Another threatens to inform the abbess about a mysterious stash of honeyed figs, though no one can prove they existed. And of course, there's heartbreak. When a visiting monk disappears without notice. When a friend takes final vows and grows distant. When someone you love is transferred to another convent and the letters stop coming. Your cousin sees it all tucked behind the routines, like shadows behind stained glass. Still they carry on. Because love, whether divine, forbidden, or quietly exchanged under candlelight, is part of this strange life. Not officially, not in the rule book, but in the reality of human hearts, bound by silence and psalms. So your cousin learns to write carefully, to fold paper tight, to never use names, and to tuck her own words when she dares to write them beneath the lining of her psalter cover, where only time and touch can find them. When plague comes knocking, even the holiest walls can't keep it out. What happens when fear meets faith? It begins in the dark, as most days do. A bell echoes through the stone halls like a half-remembered dream. Your cousin stirs, wraps her cloak around her shoulders, and begins her day. The year is 1347. You might know it as the year the Black Death arrived in Europe. But inside the convent, it's just another Tuesday, at least at first. A Nuns' Day in 1347 is filled with rhythm prayer work, silence repetition. Time is kept not by clocks but by bells, matins lauds, prime terce sext, nun, vespers compline. It sounds like poetry. It is in a way, but it's also a relentless schedule designed to keep the mind disciplined and the body humble. The morning begins with lauds in the chapel, where the sisters chant psalms in near darkness. Your cousin mumbles through Psalm 50 with chapped lips and sleepy eyes, her voice blending into the droning harmony. The incense smells faintly of last week's ashes. Afterward, she and Sister Imelda inspect the garden, already aware that something is wrong. The thyme has gone yellow. The bees are gone. The cat, usually fat and opinionated, won't leave the chapel. Signs, or coincidences, hard to say. Breakfast is thin porridge and stale bread. Sister Melisenda tries to liven it up with a story about a bishop who tried to exorcise a pig. It works barely. One novice giggles so hard she snorts into her bowl. Work begins. Your cousin is assigned to the scriptorium, copying verses into a ledger with ink made from oak galls and vinegar. The taste lingers on her fingertips. Outside, rain taps steadily against the high, narrow windows. By midday, the mood has shifted. News travels fast, even in cloistered places. A traveler cousin to the baker's niece has died in the next town. Black swellings, fever. A priest is said to have collapsed during Mass. The sisters whisper in the cloister hands fidgeting with their rosaries. The abbess calls for extra prayers. The younger novices are told not to worry. Historians still argue whether convents were spared the worst of the plague or merely delayed. Some suggest the isolation helped. Others point to mass graves just outside convent walls. Your cousin doesn't know that yet. She's still copying Domine Miserere Mei when the prioress coughs twice and excuses herself. After sext, the air feels heavier. The sisters disinfect their hands with rosemary vinegar and recite Psalm 91, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." But fear creeps in anyway. The infirmary is stocked with dried herbs and wax-coated bandages. Sister Ursula boils elderflower tea in the kitchen. Someone suggests burning juniper. Another less helpfully suggests fleeing to the hills. But there is nowhere to go. Instead, the abbess assigns new chores. Everyone must help clean. The chapel is scrubbed with lye and sage water. The choir stalls polished until they gleam like frozen bread crust. Your cousin is handed a bucket and sent to sanitize the chapter house, which mostly smells of dust and old secrets. Afternoon arrives. No visitors, no letters. Just a cart from the nearby monastery, dropping off more vinegar and, oddly, a live chicken. No one is sure why. Possibly a bribe. Possibly a joke. Vespers brings more chanting, more incense, more flickering light. This time your cousin notices who isn't there. Sister Odelia, usually loud enough to drown out the choir master, is missing. Later someone says she had a fever. The infirmary is closed now for quiet and rest. Night falls fast. After compline, the sisters gather for what passes as recreation embroidery, mending sharing tales. Tonight, there are fewer stories and more sighs. One novice stitches a skull into her sampler, then quickly covers it with a fig leaf design. Lights are dimmed. The dormitory grows still. Your cousin lies awake, listening to the breath of those around her. A cough, a murmur, the creak of someone shifting in their straw mattress. She wonders if the world outside still turns, if the sun rose in Florence, if anyone is singing in Avignon. She wonders whether if the plague comes here, they will sing louder or softer, and she wonders quietly if Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims, is listening. She's never prayed to him before, but tonight she tries, just in case. In a place of worship, the loudest battles were fought in whispers over pitch pride and politics. The chapel is quiet but not peaceful. There's a tension that hums beneath the stone arches, an invisible line drawn between two rows of wooden choir stalls. On the left sit the older nuns, voices weathered and strong. On the right, the novices and recent vow takers, eyes wide backs, stiff, uncertain whether to sing with boldness or caution. Your cousin has learned quickly that the choir is not just for worship. It's a stage for power plays. Choir stalls and power plays. Every day, 7 times a day, the sisters gather to sing the divine office. It's one of the few parts of convent life that allows expression. A well-sung psalm can turn heads. A faltering voice can spark whispers. And placement in the choir isn't random. It's a visible sign of favor, experience, and sometimes secret alliances. Sister Euphemia, who has sung here for 27 years, leads with a voice like carved oak. Her tone is steady, authoritative, just a little too loud. She was once a music tutor in a noble house, and it shows. She always corrects those who lag behind the tempo, especially Sister Agnes, who sometimes intentionally drags the final note just to annoy her. Then there's the matter of the descant. It's the high harmony sung during feast days, reserved for the best voices or the most politically favored ones. Last Michaelmas, the abbess gave it to Sister Juliana, bypassing Euphemia entirely. There were 3 days of unusually loud psalm singing afterward, and someone accidentally dyed Juliana's veil a shade too close to purple. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were petty or potent. But within the confines of a cloister where ambition has few places to go, the choir becomes a battleground. Your cousin, still new, sings softly, but she's observant. She notices who eyes whom during hymn 73, who swaps music scrolls, who forgets to bow on purpose, and who mysteriously receives extra parchment in their choir cubby. These gestures are the convent's version of elbow jabs and side eyes. It's not all rivalry, though. There's beauty, too. When the voices blend just right, especially during Compline, it's like breathing in harmony. One sister describes it as feeling the ceiling lift. Another says it's the only time she forgets her feet are cold. Your cousin begins to look forward to these moments, not because of the notes, but the feeling. The brief, shared stillness. The knowledge that even the crankiest sister must exhale on the same beat. But music is also a tool of discipline. Miss a note, and you might get reassigned to cloister cleaning. Show too much enthusiasm for certain lyrics, like the infamous "Let my soul magnify the Lord," and you might earn yourself an inquiry from the abbess about emotional stability. Sister Melisenda once claimed that certain psalms were coded messages. Listen, she'd say, Psalm 39 is clearly about boredom. Psalm 88, existential dread with a tambourine. Your cousin laughed the first time, but after several hundred repetitions, she starts to wonder. Feast days change the mood entirely. The chapel is draped with embroidered banners. Candles are doubled. The singing becomes more elaborate, almost theatrical. Each sister receives a designated pitch, assigned days in advance. There's rehearsal, drama, tears. One year, Sister Theophania lost her voice mid-hymn and had to mime the rest of the chant. She's still bitter. This year, your cousin is assigned a solo line in Psalm 122, just 5 words. But it's a milestone. The night before, she rehearses in the scriptorium, using the echo from the walls to measure her breath. Sister Euphemia walks by, pauses, and says, "Don't sing it like you're asking for forgiveness. Sing it like you're already forgiven." She does. And when the feast arrives and the chapel fills with light, and her voice rises for that brief shining phrase, she doesn't think about hierarchy or placement. She thinks about the way the sound wraps around the stone, how the others hold their breath, how the candle flames flicker in time. Afterward, no one says anything. But later that night, she finds a dried violet on her pillow. The politics of the choir continue. Voices rise and fall. Alliances shift. The descant will always be fought over. But your cousin now knows the real secret. It's not about who sings the loudest. It's about who listens between the notes. What if the leader herself ran away? When the abbess disappears, chaos follows and secrets bubble up fast. Rain slicks the stones as you approach the gates. The abbess is missing, not ill, not meditating in the chapel, not praying in solitude. Missing. The case of the escaped abbess. It begins on a gray morning when the Sister Amicia, the convent's most punctual clock in human form, notices the abbess's chair is empty during prime. A few glances are exchanged, but no one speaks. By terce, a whisper ripples through the choir stalls. By sext, the guest quarters are searched. Nothing. Her habit is gone. So are her travel shoes. And the small locked cabinet behind her writing desk. Open. Empty. Only a single pressed flower left behind on the sill. A violet. There's no official rule book for this sort of thing. Abbesses don't just leave, especially not without permission escort, or at least an elaborate reason involving relics. But your cousin hears it from Sister Melisenda before anyone else. She's gone. Truly gone. Left a note on the back of Psalm 38. It reads, "I need to remember who I am." The convent doesn't exactly panic, but it doesn't not panic either. The prioress tries to maintain order, but her voice shakes during Vespers. Sister Euphemia takes over chant direction with the eagerness of a cat claiming a vacated cushion. Novices are told to remain composed. Meanwhile, your cousin spots Sister Agnes whispering suspiciously near the stable boy at the outer gate. He looks pale. It doesn't take long for a theory to form. Historians still argue whether the abbess ran off alone or with someone. A priest, a childhood friend, a merchant with thick eyebrows and questionable morals. The records are vague, but one thing is clear. She crossed the river at dawn. A nun from a neighboring convent later claimed she saw a woman in gray boarding a cart headed toward the coast. The bishop is informed. He sends a letter requesting clarification. The prioress sends back a carefully worded reply about unexpected sabbatical and spiritual retreat. But behind the scenes, the sisters are having the time of their lives. There are whispered reenactments in the cloister. Someone sneaks into the abbess's quarters and finds a stash of dried pear slices, 3 volumes of translated Ovid, and a tiny painted icon of Saint Bridget with "Go Girl" scratched on the back. The dormitory buzzes with rumors. Some believe she was in love. Others think she had a vision. One novice insists the abbess found a secret door behind the chapel and followed a holy voice into the forest. Sister Imelda scoffs and says, "Nonsense." If she left, it was because she was tired of listening to Euphemia argue about descants. For your cousin, the mystery is thrilling and unsettling. The convent runs like a wheel. Remove the hub, and everything wobbles. Meals are late. Chores are reassigned. One day, 2 sisters show up to the same garden plot and spend 20 silent minutes pretending the other doesn't exist. And yet the world doesn't fall apart. The prioress stabilizes. Sister Euphemia moderates. The bell still rings. The garden still grows. Life, as it turns out, is more resilient than the rule of Saint Benedict implies. Then 3 weeks later, the abbess returns. She appears at the gate with muddy boots, sunburnt cheeks, and a half-eaten fig in her pocket. No entourage, no apology, just a quiet request for entry and a nod to the gatekeeper. Inside, the sisters gather, some angry, some relieved, most just curious. The abbess says only this: "I needed silence, the real kind." She says nothing more. But after her return, a few things change. The library restrictions ease slightly. The garden schedule is adjusted to allow solitary tending. New chant selections appear in the choir book, softer, slower, more introspective. And Sister Euphemia, much to everyone's relief, is told to sit 2 seats back and practice humility. Your cousin watches the abbess carefully. She seems lighter, still firm, still commanding, but her eyes linger on the windows longer. Her voice softens during prayer. She even laughs once quietly at a joke about leaks. No one asks where she went, but sometimes in the afternoons, your cousin finds her sitting in the far corner of the garden with a journal, writing, watching. And once, just once, she catches her whispering the last lines of Psalm 38. With hope I wait, want to break the rules. In the convent, rebellion came wrapped in wool hoods and riddles. Disobedience in a convent is rarely loud. No smashing of chalices, no dramatic storming off in the middle of vespers. No, here rebellion is quieter, but oddly creative. When a nun steps out of line, she's not met with fire and brimstone, but something far stranger, possessions and punishments. Your cousin witnesses her first correction, one rainy morning just after Lauds. Sister Odelia has been caught again sneaking into the kitchen after hours. What for? A sliver of cheese and a handful of honeyed almonds. The scandal. The abbess doesn't scold. She simply nods and assigns a penance 3 days of copying the rule of Saint Benedict, backward, in Latin, with a goose feather quill. The punishment isn't meant to be cruel. It's meant to be humbling, time-consuming. A gentle nudge toward repentance with just enough absurdity to make it memorable. Possessions, however, are trickier. Technically, nuns aren't supposed to own personal items. Vows of poverty are clear. But in practice, most sisters have a few unofficial treasures. A carved comb, a beaded rosary from their mother, a snippet of lace sewn inside a sleeve. These objects live in the twilight zone of convent law, permitted as long as they're not seen. Sister Melisende has a whole collection. Feathers, pebbles, dried petals. She calls them saints without names. She hides them in the binding of old hymnals. Once, she gifts your cousin a tiny brass bell with no clapper. To ring for thoughts, she says. Your cousin keeps it in her slipper. Punishments vary depending on the transgression. Fall asleep during matins. You might be asked to sweep the cloister with a broom made of damp reeds. Misplace your psalter. You'll spend a week transcribing the lamentations of Jeremiah. Drop a crucifix. A month of kitchen duty without honey. But the most peculiar punishments are the symbolic ones. There's the penitent veil, a scratchy wool hood with only one eye hole. The silent spoon, to be worn around the neck during meals to discourage chatter. And then there's the chair, a wobbly stool placed in the cloister garden under the gooseberry bush, not for sitting, just standing beside it, contemplating. Historians still argue whether these forms of penance were widespread or unique to certain orders. What's clear is that each convent developed its own system, a blend of tradition, superstition, and mild theatricality. And some punishments were entirely performative. Once, Sister Euphemia caught 2 novices giggling during Compline. The next morning, they were assigned to polish every candlestick in the chapel while singing the entirety of Psalm 119 in a monotone, loudly. It took 5 hours. The giggling stopped, temporarily. But not all infractions are so innocent. Occasionally, a sister breaks a vow more seriously. A stolen relic, a letter to a former suitor, a whispered confession of doubt. These cases go to the abbess. Sometimes she responds with exile, sending the nun to a stricter convent far away. Other times, the punishment is more internal. Weeks of silence, loss of privileges. In one case, a nun was made to wear her veil inside out for an entire season to remind her where her loyalty lies. Your cousin wonders often about the purpose behind these punishments. Are they for correction, humility control, or just a way to pass the time in a world with few other tools? She asks Sister Agnes, once half serious, half joking, what the worst punishment she ever saw was. Agnes thinks for a moment and says, forgiveness when you're not ready for it. The convent also has its redemption rituals. A sister who repents sincerely might be granted a cleansing duty, cleaning the reliquary, polishing the chapel windows, weaving new linen for the altar. These acts are treated with reverence, not punishment, but healing through labor. One spring, after an unnamed transgression, your cousin volunteers for one of these duties. She's assigned to help rebuild the garden shrine. For 3 days, she works in silence, pressing stones into place, painting faded icons, and whispering psalms under her breath. No one asks what she did. No one needs to. By the end, she feels lighter, not absolved exactly, just listened to. That's the strange grace of convent discipline. It's not about wrath. It's about attention. Someone noticing. Someone responding. Even if it's with a wool hood and an eye roll. In the end, your cousin learns that every nun carries a little penance, whether given or chosen. A heavy cross, a frayed cord, a story too sharp to tell. And sometimes the worst punishments are the ones you give yourself. Was it a vision, a possession, or just one nun's dramatic flair? The devil may or may not have entered the incense. It begins with a shriek, not the melodious type you hear in hymns. A real, bone-tingling, corridor-echoing shriek that wakes half the dormitory just after matins. Your cousin bolts upright, nearly trips over her shoes, and follows the noise to the chapel, where Sister Benedicta is standing on a pew, eyes wide, screaming about the devil hiding in the incense burner, when the devil visited the cloister. To be clear, it's not the first time Sister Benedicta has made dramatic claims. She once accused a sparrow of carrying messages from hell and refused to eat apples for a year after one rolled ominously off a table. But this is different. She is shaking pale, muttering phrases in Latin that don't quite match anything from the Psalms. The abbess arrives, still half asleep and unamused. But when Sister Benedicta faints dead away in front of the altar, things get serious. She is carried to the infirmary. The chapel is sealed. Prayers are requested, and word spreads like fire through dry parchment. Someone whispers that it was the result of a curse. Another claims Sister Benedicta had been reading the Book of Job too theatrically. Sister Imelda naturally blames the full moon and a surplus of fennel in the dinner stew. Historians still argue whether such events were demonic possessions, spiritual crises, or just the results of stress and starvation. But convent records are full of similar incidents. Fitz visions, mysterious laughter, prophetic babbling, often involving the same handful of particularly imaginative sisters. Your cousin, intrigued, begins to investigate, quietly. She visits the infirmary under the pretense of bringing herbs. Sister Benedicta is mumbling again, eyes closed. Something about feathers and fire and the number 7. She also keeps asking for her goose. Yes, her goose. Apparently, Sister Benedicta raised a goose in secret behind the herb shed, claimed it helped her discern sin, named it Cyril. One day, it vanished. Some say it flew off. Others whisper it was eaten by the gardener. Either way, Sister Benedicta has not been the same since. The abbess, meanwhile, consults the local priest. He arrives with a vial of holy water and the unfortunate disposition of someone who has been roused too early and not paid enough for the journey. He performs a brief exorcism, not with drama, but with a quiet sigh and an unusually fast reading of the appropriate prayers. Nothing explodes. No windows shatter. Sister Benedicta sneezes twice and falls asleep. But the episode sparks a kind of ripple. Sister Odelia dreams of snakes. Sister Theophania claims to see fiery writing on the chapel wall that vanishes when anyone else looks. Sister Euphemia, in a moment of true menace, suggests perhaps the demonic presence is drawn to dissonant harmonies and insists on new choir arrangements. The abbess issues a decree: no more solo meditation after dark. No herbs stronger than mint without permission. And absolutely no naming poultry after saints. Still, the unease lingers. Your cousin finds a prayer book with the margins scribbled over in what looks like 2 different hands. One of the phrases reads, "He waits in the incense." Another reads, "Goose is watching." She doesn't know whether to laugh or hide it. In response, the sisters begin blessing everything. Buckets, brooms, once even the candlestick cupboard. Sister Melisende invents a song for protection that involves clapping on the 3rd verse. It becomes a dormitory favorite, and then, as quickly as it began, it ends. Sister Benedicta recovers, sort of. She walks with a new air of solemnity and insists on wearing an extra scapular just in case. The abbess returns to routine. The chapel incense resumes. The priest is never invited back. Your cousin reflects weeks later that whatever the cause, hysteria, hunger, grief, or something stranger, the real fear wasn't the devil. It was that no one would believe her. Because belief in the convent is both sacred and dangerous. You are expected to believe in angels' visions and miracles, but only the right ones at the right time, approved by the right authorities. See light in the garden at dusk, and you might be blessed. See the same light after a bad night's sleep, and you might be accused of pride or worse imagination. So when a nun claims the devil whispered through the incense, what do? You listen, you pray, you hide your own goose, just in case. Spies, smugglers, scribes, and they wore habits. These nuns had networks that would make the Illuminati blush. You'd think life in a cloister is simple: pray, eat, sing, repeat. But under the surface of this supposedly sheltered world moves a thread of quiet mischief and even quieter ambition. Not every nun is content to copy psalms and tend lavender. Some slip through the cracks. Some push the boundaries. And a rare few become something entirely unexpected. None as spy, smuggler, or scribe. It starts with Sister Agnes, always the twitchy one, Her hands never stop moving, sewing, folding, adjusting, always fiddling with something under her veil. Your cousin assumes she's nervous. But one day in the scriptorium, she catches a glimpse of what Sister Agnes is really up to, sealing a tiny packet inside the spine of a hymn book, sealing it with wax and hair. Later, the packet disappears, and not into a shelf, into a visitor's satchel. It turns out Sister Agnes has connections. A cousin who works in the bishop's archive, a brother who trades in paper, whatever that means. Over time, your cousin learns that Agnes sends messages out of the convent, coded notes, copied passages, small items stitched into altar cloths. To whom and for what, no one knows for sure. But a few sisters call her the postmaster. Then there's Sister Claricia. Officially, she illuminates manuscripts. Unofficially, she adds extra figures into the margins, mischievous rabbits, dancing skeletons, women chasing bishops with ladles. One day, a monk reviews a borrowed book and finds a tiny painted nun holding up a sign that reads, "Bless this mess." Claricia is reprimanded but not removed. Her work is too good. Instead, she's reassigned to create decorative pieces for visiting patrons, some of which include secret symbols from languages she's never been taught. When asked how she learned them, she simply says, "I have ears." Historians still argue whether nuns served formal roles as spies, but documented cases show some acted as informants, messengers, and even cryptographers, especially those with family ties to politics or noble houses. The veil, as it turns out, can be excellent camouflage. Sister Melisenda, for instance, writes letters in lemon juice, revealed only by the heat of a candle. She teaches your cousin the trick one chilly evening in the kitchen. They test it using psalm verses and spice-rubbed parchment. It works. The secret message, the cheese thief strikes again. Your cousin laughs, but the skill sticks. And then there's the matter of books. The convent has rules, yes, but it also has a growing demand for knowledge, not just the holy kind. Some sisters copy astronomical diagrams. Others transcribe maps of far-off cities, whispered into memory by passing friars. There's even a growing glossary of herbs in the west closet, organized by ailments no one admits to having. Your cousin contributes slowly, a sketch of a windmill, a recipe from her grandmother, a short poem written in hexameter that ends with an awkward rhyme for penance. These aren't just hobbies. They're documentation, communication, legacy. Because not every message is meant to be sent. Some are meant to be found. Sister Therese once buried a box under the chapel floorboards. No one knew, until the day a tile cracked and revealed a cache of letters, dried flowers, and a carving of a woman's face. With the same nose as Therese, she denied it all. But the others began checking the floor every week. Still, not all stories end in humor. One sister, long gone before your cousin's time, was accused of heresy after smuggling theological essays to a reformist monk. She vanished one night. Some say she was transferred. Others say she was sent to a distant priory. But Sister Imelda once found her name scratched inside a lantern with the words, "We are not trapped. We are sentinels." That phrase makes your cousin pause, because the longer she stays, the more she sees the movement of parchment, the coded glances, the quiet trades. Nuns passing bundles wrapped in cloth, disguised as embroidery. A visiting bishop who receives more than wine. A list of convents in far-off regions, each marked with initials she doesn't recognize. Spies, scribes, smugglers, or maybe historians. Women archiving themselves in the only ways allowed, not for fame, but for continuity, not to escape, but to endure. Late one evening, your cousin sits in the scriptorium copying a simple psalm. But in the margin, just beneath the illuminated O, she adds a flick of gold leaf and writes a single word. Remember. No one sees her do it, but someone someday will. Holy vows couldn't stop hungry hearts. Inside every fast, a food heist was brewing. For a place built on prayer and discipline, the convent sure talks a lot about food. Not out loud, of course, at least not during meals, but always somehow through whispers, glances, and suspicious stains on scapulars. Feasts, fasts, and food heists. Your cousin quickly learns that convent cuisine is as much about hierarchy as holiness. On ordinary days, the meals are humble, watery pottage, barley bread, thin ale. But even here, there are secrets. The cellarer, an ancient grim woman known only as Sister Radegund, controls the pantry like a dragon guarding treasure. She keeps the keys on a ring that jingles ominously whenever she moves, and every nun knows that where the keys go, the cheese follows. Feast days are different. That's when the tables bloom with dried fruits, roasted vegetables, sweetened gruel, and the rare delight of a fresh egg. If Saint Lucy is especially well honored, there might even be sugared nuts. The anticipation builds for days. The choir sings brighter. The novitiates clean faster. And someone inevitably tries to sneak a taste early. That's where the heists begin. Small ones at first. A novice accidentally takes 2 pairs instead of 1. Sister Euphemia forgets that she already had an oatcake. Sister Agnes stashes raisins in her sleeve for a midnight snack, claiming they're for medicinal purposes. Dryness of the soul, she says, utterly deadpan. But then comes the Lent incident. In the middle of a fast so strict even the bees seem lethargic, someone steals an entire wheel of goat cheese from the pantry. Gone. No crumbs, no rind, just an empty shelf and a faint odor of thyme. The abbess is not amused. An inquiry is launched. Spoons are inspected, veils lifted. The chapel is searched in case of misplaced dairy devotion. Finally, they find the rind under a loose board in the scriptorium. No one confesses. The cheese becomes a legend, the thief a ghostly hero. A tiny wedge of the rind is later used to mark Psalm 136 in the communal Bible. Historians still argue whether food theft in convents was born of hunger boredom or silent rebellion. Most likely it was all 3. The rules of fasting are strict, especially during Lent and Advent. No meat, no dairy. On some days, no solid food at all. The sisters drink broth made from boiled nettles and pray for spiritual nourishment, while their stomachs echo in reply. Your cousin learns the tricks quickly. Eat slowly. Choose the warmest seat near the kitchen. Trade favors for extra bread. One novice claims to have a system for identifying which bowls the cook favors. If it smells like rosemary, she says, guard it with your life. And yet food isn't just sustenance, it's ritual, memory, power. On St. Catherine's feast, the sisters eat saffron buns. Sister Melisenda claims they bring visions. 1 year after 3 in a row, she insists she saw St. Catherine herself licking honey off her fingers. The kitchen becomes a place of pilgrimage. Sister Claricia begins painting miniature saints on the flour sacks. Someone leaves poems near the bread oven. And Sister Therese starts naming the loaves Jerome, Agatha, Basil. Then comes the great fig debacle. A visiting abbot gifts the convent a basket of dried figs, rare, expensive, holy fruit. They are counted, cataloged, and placed in the pantry. Within 2 days, 6 are missing. The abbess demands an accounting. The prioress suspects the stable boy. Sister Euphemia blames the moral decay of modern cloisters. Eventually, Sister Agnes finds one fig half-eaten, tucked behind a statue of Saint Roche. The matter is closed, but trust never fully recovers. Meanwhile, Sister Radegund begins hiding food in increasingly odd places. Under pew cushions, inside hollowed books, once in a sock. She calls it strategic sanctity. Your cousin just calls it confusing. But not all food stories are comic. Some sisters struggle. One confesses to hoarding crusts in fear of another famine. Another fasts too often too long and faints during terce. Your cousin learns to watch for hollow cheeks, shaking hands, unspoken grief stitched into tablecloths. Still, the convent finds ways to feast, even in silence. A spoon passed quietly. A smile over a shared plum. A feast not of quantity, but of gesture and sometimes rebellion. Sister Odelia once declared a feast of saints not yet recognized. She and 2 others set a midnight table with pilfered figs, stale bread, and candle stubs. They toasted to Saint Ethelburga the Unread, Saint Margaret the Unwashed, and Saint Anonymous, patron of lost cheese. It was beautiful and completely forbidden. They spent a week polishing the chapel floor, but it was worth it. Because in a place of discipline and hunger, even a crumb can feel like defiance. And a feast, no matter how small, can feel like freedom. When a sister dies, the convent breathes differently. It exhales not in sorrow exactly, but in rhythm. Like the turning of a page, the closing of a book. The routines slow, but they do not stop. The bells still ring, the bread still rises. But something unseen is missing, and everyone feels it. Death in the convent. It begins quietly. Sister Juliana doesn't wake for lauds. No panic, just a pause. Someone goes to check. A moment later, the infirmary bell tolls once low, drawn-out final. The sound doesn't echo, it sinks. The sisters gather still in their cloaks, still half asleep, and kneel in the chapel. The abbess reads a psalm. No dramatics, just breath and scripture. Outside, the crows settle on the roof in their usual crooked line. Sister Juliana was old, very old. Her hands shook. Her chants wandered off key, and her knees had more stories than most libraries. But she was kind, and in a place like this, that matters. Preparations begin. Death in the convent is handled by the sisters themselves. There is no undertaker, no velvet curtains, just ritual. Her body is washed by 3 chosen nuns, gently, slowly, as they whisper psalms for her passing soul. They comb her hair, press lavender into her sleeves, and dress her in her cleanest habit. She is placed in the small stone chapel near the garden lit by candles, and the ever-present scent of beeswax and thyme. Your cousin helps gather herbs for the vigil, rosemary for remembrance, bay for strength. The garden feels colder that day. The mint has withered. The marigolds bend their heads. Each sister takes a turn sitting with the body. Some pray, others just sit. Sister Melisende sketches a rose on the inside of her palm and whispers, "It's for the journey." Sister Agnes stares straight ahead, jaw tight, hands folded with military precision. By tradition, the vigil lasts until dawn. There is singing, low, slow, one voice at a time, a lullaby of sorts. The same lullabies sung to new novices in their first frightened nights, now reversed. At sunrise, the funeral begins. The body is carried by 4 sisters in silence through the cloistered garden. The bells toll. A procession forms, quiet, slow, reverent. Sister Euphemia for once sings softly. Sister Radagon sprinkles salt on the path behind them. A local priest, barely old enough to know how to hold a thurible, reads the final rites. And then comes the earth. The convent has its own burial plot just beyond the garden wall. Small, fenced, shaded by a stubborn old yew tree that refuses to bloom. The graves are unmarked, save for tiny stone tokens placed by the sisters. A comb, a feather, a scrap of song lyrics. They place Sister Juliana in the ground, wrapped in a woolen shroud stitched by novices long ago. One by one, the sisters drop handfuls of earth. No words, just the soft thud of dirt. Then a pause, then breath. But not all sisters go so quietly. There are stories. Sister Beatrix once refused burial. Not in speech, she'd taken her vow of silence seriously to the end, but in posture. When they tried to lay her down, her arms stayed rigid, pointing toward the scriptorium. It took 3 tries to fold her into rest. Another nun, long before your cousin's time, was said to have written her own eulogy on the walls of the laundry room. A series of verses in chalk, reappearing every year despite being scrubbed clean. Historians still argue whether these stories are fact metaphor or convent myth-making. But the sisters remember them all the same, and sometimes they resist. One winter, the abbess declares Sister Heloise will be buried in the convent yard. But Sister Heloise had once whispered she wanted to rest in the orchard where the bees go. 2 nights after the burial, someone, likely Sister Agnes, digs up the grave and moves the body under the apple tree. No one speaks of it. But the next spring, the apples bloom redder than ever. Your cousin thinks often about death now, not in fear, but in shape. The way it curves around silence. The way it lives in routines, in remembered voices, in the names spoken at dawn. She begins keeping a list, not of deaths, but of favorite moments from each sister. A laugh, a phrase, a smell, a line of chant. Because that's how you keep them, by memory, by mischief, by the soil that still grows marigolds. Longing, it turns out, is not a sin, at least not the way they feel it here. It weaves through the convent like the scent of damp wool and rosemary, always present, soft at first, but never quite fading. You can't escape it. You live with it. And sometimes you learn to turn it into something beautiful. Longing and legacy. Your cousin stands in the cloistered garden at dusk, a psalter under one arm, her free hand brushing the tops of late summer sage. A cool breeze nudges the veil from her cheek. Behind her, the bell for vespers sounds familiar, steady, like a heartbeat she no longer questions. She's not the same girl who arrived all those years ago, with wide eyes and trembling fingers. She walks with certainty now. She sings with strength. She knows every stone in this place, every creak of the wood, every petal in the pressed flower collection hidden under her mattress. But the longing still lingers. It's not always for the world outside. That fades mostly. The colors of cities blur. The faces of brothers grow soft around the edges. Even the sound of laughter from a market square becomes more memory than ache. No, the longing is deeper now. It's for freedom of thought, for meaning, for moments when silence isn't restraint, but rest. And in a strange way, the convent offers that too. Because within its walls, legacy is crafted in quiet acts. In the scriptorium, your cousin finishes copying her 5th book of hours. She inks a tiny line of poetry into the border. The sun does not rise louder than the heart. She knows the abbess won't notice. But maybe someday, someone else will. In the garden, she plants a single sprig of rosemary where Sister Juliana once sat. No one asks why. No one needs to. At night, she teaches a new novice how to fold letters so they don't crumple when hidden in hymnals. The girl asks if it's allowed. Your cousin just smiles and says it's not forbidden, it's tradition. Because tradition here is made not just by rules, but by those who quietly bend them. Sister Melisende, now older and slower, asks your cousin to take over as library assistant. She accepts. Her first act, reorganizing the forbidden shelf by theme rather than danger. Visions, stars, herbs, laughter. Historians still argue whether nuns left lasting marks on culture or were erased by the systems they served. But in this quiet corner of time, your cousin knows better. Legacy isn't always grand. Sometimes it's a line of chant hummed in a new voice, a pressed violet between parchment, a sleeping novice who doesn't cry the first night because someone left her an extra blanket. It's found in choice. Not the choice to leave, but the choice to stay and still imagine, still dream, still build something even within walls. And when she lies awake at night, she no longer wonders. She remembers. The glances, the notes, the tiny defiance is sewn in thread. She listens. And in the hush of the convent, something has changed. A pulse, a tension, a beginning. Somewhere quietly, the sisters are starting to say no. The candles are low, the cloisters silent, and the corridors cold. But don't let the hush fool you. Behind these stone walls, something strange is happening. Nuns, those gentle, veiled women of the church, are beginning to say no. Not loudly, not with swords or banners, but with silence, with stares, with small rebellions stitched into the very seams of their lives. You're about to discover how the most obedient women in Christendom became quietly ungovernable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching, from what city, and what time. I love seeing our sleepy little map light up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're waking before dawn in a 12th century abbey. The stone beneath your straw mattress hasn't softened overnight. Your knees ache, your feet are cold. Obedience is expected absolute, unquestioning, and daily. There's a bell for rising, for praying, for eating, for thinking. Even your thoughts are scheduled. But today, you pause, just a beat, a moment. And that, for some, is the beginning. You're not alone. Across Europe, hundreds of women cloistered in convents are beginning to ask quiet questions. Why must we obey a bishop who's never met us? 7. Why are we forbidden to write when we can read scripture better than most priests? Why does our piety demand silence while monks debate theology over roast fowl? Historians still argue whether these acts of resistance were coordinated or spontaneous. What's clear is this: even in a world where disobedience could mean excommunication, or worse, some nuns found ways to rebel. And they were clever about it. Take Hildegard of Bingen. You've probably heard of her composer, mystic healer. But beneath the ethereal halo was a woman who flatly refused to accept the restrictions placed on her. When her male superiors denied her permission to preach, she just did it anyway, claiming divine visions as her license. And when they tried to stop her burial rites after she defied orders, her sisters ringed her grave with torches and dared the bishop to interfere. Then there's the tale of the French nun who swapped her confessor's sermons for political manifestos, hiding leaflets in her prayer book. Or the English prioress who taught Latin to her novices, not just so they could read psalms, but so they could interpret canon law, out-argue male clerics, and defend themselves in church courts. Rebellion didn't have to be grand. Sometimes it looked like eye contact, a slow, deliberate crossing of arms during a bishop's sermon, a refusal to chant on command, a door quietly closed just a bit too firmly. These were women trained in restraint, and they turned that discipline into armor. One fringe detail often overlooked: some convents created entirely fictitious saints, with made-up relics, local feast days, and miracles only the sisters could confirm. It sounds absurd until you realize this gave them autonomy. They controlled the sacred calendar. The bishop could meddle in Lent, sure, but Saint Imelda's feast, that was theirs. Of course, not every nun participated. Some clung to obedience like a lifeline. Others feared punishment too deeply. And some genuinely believed the system worked, as long as says you stayed very, very quiet. But there were always those who resisted, who broke curfew, who challenged authority, who slipped notes under cell doors. You can almost hear them now, whispering through the centuries. And tonight, we're going to listen to their stories, one hidden stitch, one smuggled letter, one stubborn abbess at a time. Your needle hovers above the linen, the fine woolen thread looped just so. You're working by lamplight in the convent's embroidery room, a place meant for holy contemplation and silent repetitive labor. But the room is not as silent as it seems. Beneath the hum of sewing and the scrape of chairs, another language is being spoken, one made of tiny stitches and subtle symbols. This is not just embroidery, it's communication, it's protest. You knot the thread twice at the corner. That double knot isn't decorative, it's a sign. Sister Agnes always uses it when she's hiding something in her work. You learned it from her, just as she learned it from someone before. The cloth you're sewing will drape an altar or veil a nun's head, but it will also carry secrets, coded patterns only your sisters understand. This wasn't some elaborate code book with secret alphabets. No, that would have been far too dangerous. This was subtler. A particular arrangement of flowers could reference the Song of Songs, which was a favorite among nuns for its passionate mystic language, half prayer, half love letter. A misplaced lily might signal discontent. An extra vine on a hem could mark solidarity. You're not just sewing fabric, you're sewing resistance into something sacred. Historians still debate whether these embroidered messages were truly widespread or mostly symbolic gestures, but the physical evidence is compelling. Several preserved habits and altar cloths show anomalies patterns inconsistent with official church designs, but curiously consistent within the same abbey. Coincidence, maybe. But it's a funny thing how many convents use the same seven-pointed star when the official pattern called for six. There's a famous piece of altar linen from a German convent dated around 1275 where the border is laced with strange little birds. Nothing sacrilegious, just odd. Birds with too many feathers, birds nesting in impossible trees. When compared with drawings in a sister's private prayer book, the pattern translates into a rough message: we remain. It's haunting in its simplicity. We remain despite bishops' taxes, poor rations, and the silent pressure to be invisible. Not every stitch was symbolic, of course. Some were just beautiful. But that, too, was rebellion. To create something intricate, stunning, and wholly unnecessary was in a way a rejection of the purely utilitarian vision of convent labor. Why spend weeks embellishing a single chasuble sleeve? Because you could. Because it was yours. Some orders caught on. A few abbots demanded plain habits, unadorned linens, and no flourishes. But by then, the nuns had already moved on, hiding initials in the hems, weaving sisterly puns into tapestry borders, even incorporating the local dialect into Latin prayers through visual motifs. There's one cheeky example from Italy, a series of baptismal cloths featuring tiny stitched animals all facing backward. What did it mean? No one knows for sure. One theory is that it was a quiet way of saying, we're not walking your way. Even the act of sewing itself was loaded. In a world where women had limited access to power, embroidery was one of the few forms of creation entirely under their control. Needlework could not be censored. It could not be erased. It was portable, persistent, and deeply personal. You imagine Sister Clare, age 16, sneaking a line of verse into the hem of a veil. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's a line from a banned book, one she copied before the prior confiscated it. She knows no one will notice unless they're looking. These secret stitches did more than decorate. They knit the community together. They reminded each other you are seen, you are heard, even if your voice cannot rise above a whisper. And tonight, in the quiet flicker of lamplight, they whisper still. You're holding a slip of parchment so thin it might vanish if you breathe too hard. The ink has faded, but the words still burn. It's not scripture. It's not a prayer. It's a letter, and it's not meant to stay within these walls. Long before texts and telegraphs, medieval nuns found ways to make their voices travel. Messages hidden in hollowed-out prayer books. Letters disguised as liturgical instructions. Entire political appeals tucked inside the bindings of hymnals sent out for repair. Covert correspondence wasn't a rare crime. It was a quiet art. You've probably been told that nuns were cut off from the world. And in theory they were. Cloistered, sworn to silence, no contact without permission. But in practice, the mail still moved. Trusted lay servants, many of whom had loyalties to the convent that outmatched their fear of the bishop, carried more than bread and wool. They carried stories, petitions, warnings, sometimes even bribes. One of the most striking examples, the 14th century abbess of a French Benedictine house who wrote directly to the Pope. Not once, not twice, 32 times. Her complaints that the local bishop was interfering with her management, that male clergy were siphoning off the convent's income, and that she intended to defend her sister's autonomy unto eternal judgment. You have to admire the flair. Historians still argue how often these letters actually influenced policy, but we know they reached their recipients. Several royal archives from England to Sicily contain preserved nun-written appeals, many signed not with names but with titles like Servant of the Silent Voice or Daughter of the Greater House. They were indirect poetic and full of metaphor, yet unmistakably political. The language mattered. These weren't desperate cries. They were legal arguments wrapped in scripture, embroidered with flattery and aimed like arrows. Some even quoted church law back at the very men who enforced it. That's gutsy, even now. And it wasn't just clerics who received them. There are records, sparse but provocative, suggesting that certain convents wrote to rebels during civil wars, advising, warning, possibly even directing. In one legendary case, a group of Spanish nuns allegedly sent maps to anti-royalist troops via embroidered banners, each stitch representing a route or landmark. Far-fetched, maybe. But Spanish court documents show inquiries into a textile conspiracy around the same time. Then there's the curious case of the German nun who wrote love letters to a knight and received his replies. Not in secret, but publicly posted at the abbey gate. Her sisters read them aloud during mealtime. At first, it was scandalous. Then it became, oddly, inspirational. One letter even included tactical advice for a siege hidden between verses of romantic prose. Was it sincere? Was it satire? Was she trolling the entire system? We may never know. But we do know. The bishop ordered the correspondence burned after copying it first. One fringe tidbit you might enjoy. Some convents developed their own slang or cipher. Just slight enough to pass unnoticed, but consistent enough to recognize. The shadow over the garden meant an unwanted visit from a local abbot. The dove won't land meant a letter had been intercepted. These phrases show up again and again, even across different regions. And sometimes the most powerful message was silence. A letter never replied to. A delivery refused. A sealed scroll sent back unopened. A gesture more damning than any insult. Picture it, a novice hunched in the scriptorium, copying out a letter by lamplight, hands shaking slightly, knowing that if she's caught, she could be punished, isolated, transferred. But she does it anyway, because someone has to tell the truth. Someone has to push back. You tuck the parchment into the folds of your robe. Tonight, it travels beyond the walls. The library is not where it should be. In fact, it's not even called a library. You follow Sister Margareta through a narrow passage past the herb cellar and into what appears to be a root storage room. Except it's warm, dry, and it smells not of onions, but of parchment. Beneath the false floorboards, lies the hidden library. It's not a grand chamber, just a series of narrow shelves built into the stone, holding manuscripts wrapped in linen and sealed with wax. But the moment your candle catches the faded lettering on a forbidden text, you realize this place is dangerous. To keep books outside official church indexes was one thing. To copy banned texts, that took nerve. And yet some convents did it. Not out of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but to protect what they believed was truth. Or at the very least, possibility. You lift a manuscript. It's a commentary on the Gospel of Mary, apocryphal, officially discarded, but beloved by many mystical orders. Another is a version of Aristotle's Politics, translated into Latin with marginal notes in the feminine plural, a treatise on herbal medicine annotated with warnings against church-approved bloodletting. These are not just books. They are quiet revolutions. Historians still debate whether these libraries were coordinated or isolated acts of defiance. Some believe traveling scholars helped distribute illicit texts to sympathetic abbeys. Others argue that nuns acquired them during pilgrimages or received them from relatives in academic circles. However they arrived, the books stayed and were protected. Some convents went further. In one recorded instance from 13th century Bohemia, an abbess ordered the recreation of a banned text from memory after the original was seized. 6 nuns, working in shifts, rewrote the manuscript over 10 nights. When church officials returned to inspect the premises, the abbess claimed ignorance. "We have only what God left us," she reportedly said. The ingenuity didn't stop there. A few libraries were built into the architecture itself. Hollow columns, false altars, a reliquary that, when opened just right, held not bones but books. These weren't mere hiding spots. They were declarations: what you ban, we preserve. Some convents disguised the works. A philosophical text might be rebound to resemble a hymnal. A pagan poem relabeled as a meditation on the Desert Fathers. One famous example, a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses tucked inside a faux treatise on St. Jerome. Ingenious absolutely, cheeky, delightfully so. And then there were the visual codes, illuminated letters decorated with subtle imagery unicorns that looked suspiciously like local nobles' fish whose fins formed Greek letters. The books spoke if you knew how to read them. One particularly strange case, a convent in northern Italy that housed a mirror manuscript, a book written in reverse, to be read only through a polished copper plate. Was it just a quirky scribe, or a security measure to prevent outsiders from understanding? Scholars still wonder. You run your fingers along the spine of a worn volume. Inside is a commentary from a mystic nun who claimed that divine visions revealed contradictions in church doctrine. Her work was never published, but it was copied here by candlelight again and again. That's the magic of this place. It's not just preservation. It's quiet defiance. These books are relics of questions too dangerous to ask aloud, yet here they are whispering their truths to anyone willing to find them. You slide the manuscript back into its linen wrapper, seal the wax, and replace the floorboard. The library disappears. The rebellion vanishes. But you'll remember, and so will the next sister who seeks something more than silence. The abbess doesn't walk, she marches. Robes snapping at her heels like standards in the wind. Keys jangling at her waist like medals. You'd be forgiven for mistaking her for a general. Because in a way, she is. Welcome to the command post, not of a battlefield, but of a convent. And make no mistake, This abbess runs her domain with strategic precision. She knows her lay sister's strengths, monitors supply lines like a quartermaster, and has more political correspondence on her desk than the local magistrate. You might think this is a rare exception. It isn't. All across medieval Europe, especially from the 11th to the 14th centuries, abbesses wielded extraordinary authority, spiritual, economic, and yes, political. And many ran their convents, not like religious retreats, but like fortified mini-kingdoms. Some abbeys had walls taller than the nearby village. Some had private militias. A few even had armories, not because the sisters carried weapons, but because they needed to defend against the men who did. Bandits feuding lords overreaching bishops' protection wasn't optional. It was strategy. One abbess in Saxony kept a hawk on her arm and met envoys in a formal hall flanked with banners of every noble family her sisters were related to. Another in Normandy issued tax receipts under her own seal, collected tithes, enforced feudal contracts, and once denied a bishop entry for arriving uninvited. The guards turned him away with polite apologies and loaded crossbows. Historians still argue how much real power these women held versus how much they appeared to hold. But the records are clear. Some abbesses summoned armies. Others owned ships. One even minted coinage with her initials pressed into the silver. And then there were the political alliances. Abbesses arranged treaties between warring noble families, brokered truces during civil disputes, and offered asylum to exiled courtiers. One 12th century Italian abbess is credited with preventing a regional war by threatening to excommunicate both sides. Was it spiritual authority that gave them this weight? Partly, but also the legal loopholes. Many convents were technically outside diocesan control. They answered directly to the Pope, or to no one at all legally speaking, which meant the abbess was the highest authority for miles around. Some took this to heart. One famously declared, "God is my bishop, and I report to him alone." A charming turn of phrase, unless you're the bishop, she just snubbed. Not all abbesses were beloved. Some were ruthless administrators, enforcing strict discipline, expelling rebellious nuns, even spying on their own sisters. But even their enemies admitted they got results. And let's not ignore the pageantry. Processions through town where the abbess rode side saddle on a white horse. Dinners where she received guests like a noble woman, dictating from a raised seat, while novices served courses in silence. All carefully choreographed to remind the world power does not always wear armor. Fringe detail. Some convents trained their novices in battlefield logistics, not combat, but strategy. How to supply an army, how to interpret maps, how to negotiate with angry soldiers. Because sometimes the difference between a looted cloister and a spared one was knowing exactly who to bribe and how much hay his horse needed. You watch her now, this abbess with her candlelit desk, signing letters to noble houses, scribes bustling around her like officers. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The entire convent moves in rhythm with her will. Tomorrow she'll arbitrate a land dispute. Next week, she'll welcome a visiting bishop on her terms. And next year, who knows, maybe she'll arrange a dynastic marriage or topple a lord. She is not just a holy woman. She is a strategist, a steward, a sovereign in wimpled robes. And tonight, her fortress sleeps under her watchful eye. You're hunched over a scriptorium desk, quill in hand, surrounded by the quiet rustle of parchment. The inkpot is full. the candle low. And tonight, you're not copying psalms. Tonight, you're rewriting the rules. Forgery in the medieval convent didn't always mean criminal deceit. Sometimes it was a survival tactic. Sometimes it was freedom in disguise. And sometimes it was deliciously clever mischief. These were not chaotic forgeries, no wild claims about dragons or divine lightning. These were precise, calculated adjustments. A papal bull with a suspiciously early date. A slightly altered clause in a visitation charter. A permission slip that no one quite remembers being granted, but which bears an uncannily familiar seal. Take the case of the 13th century abbey that lacked the Pope's permission to elect their own abbess. Rather than wait for bureaucracy, the nuns drafted the letter themselves, imitating the curia's language so skillfully that even future popes didn't question it. The abbess ruled for 40 years. Historians still argue about the scale of this practice. Were forged documents common or rare? But several major convents, from York to Krakow, preserved curiously convenient charters. Even Vatican records mention investigations into documents that bore all the hallmarks of authenticity, except for one mysteriously unfamiliar scribe. These weren't always grand fabrications. Sometimes they were edits, marginal notes reinterpreting canon law, an added line in a rule book to permit more flexible fasting. One convent's copy of the Rule of St. Benedict included a curious phrase: where silence is practiced, exceptions may be made for just correction. No other copy has this clause. You squint at the margin. Is it a scribal slip, or is it power reclaimed? And then there were the altered holy texts, not the Gospels, but prayers, chants, and saints' lives. Stories rewritten to emphasize female authority, to draw moral strength from sisters rather than martyrs. A hymn that once praised a male saint now bears a name scratched out and replaced with a female one. The melody stays the same, but the story changes. One notorious example, a manuscript detailing the life of Saint Apollonia, patron of dentists. In a convent copy, her torturer is recast as a jealous priest, and her triumph becomes a quiet condemnation of male spiritual control. The message subtle, but pointed. Some of these edits were probably innocent, others absolutely not. One fringe tidbit: a particular convent in the Low Countries was known for producing favorable horoscopes for nobles and bishops who donated to their house. These horoscopes were supposedly divine revelations, but the handwriting matches that of the abbey's record keeper. Coincidence? Highly doubtful. Profitable? Extremely. And not all forgeries were written. Some nuns became skilled at crafting ancient relics, bone chips, saintly combs, even drops of miraculous oil. These were sold or gifted to curry favor, ensure protection, or justify a sacred claim to land. Historians recently examined one relic that turned out to be a chicken bone painted with cinnabar and housed in an exquisitely embroidered pouch. Yet within these fictions, there was truth. The truth that these women were not passive vessels of obedience, but active participants in shaping their reality. If the law said no, they wrote a yes. If tradition blocked their path, they built a new one, quietly, persistently, and often beautifully. Tonight, your quill dips again. A date needs adjusting. A phrase needs softening. A loophole needs opening. And perhaps one small signature added with a careful flourish. No one will question it. The parchment is thick, the ink is dry, and history has always been written by those who know where to place the comma. You're sitting in the chapel, hands folded, breath slow. A bishop is visiting his robes, heavy with gold thread, his words even heavier. He preaches submission, obedience, the sacred chain of authority. You are expected to nod. You do not. This is the convent that said no. It starts small, a delayed bow, a line in the chant held a little too long. Then come the letters respectfully worded, impeccably phrased, but firm. The sisters will not accept the bishop's new confessor. They will not alter their prayer schedule. They will not surrender their lands to a man who's never walked their fields. He tries to reason, then to threaten. He quotes scripture canon law, papal precedent. They quote it back with better Latin. This real historical standoff occurred in the early 14th century at a convent outside Toulouse. The bishop demanded changes, mostly financial. He wanted to appoint a steward, redirect alms control, the convent's grain stores. The sisters objected. He insisted. They refused. Historians still debate whether the bishop's intentions were reformist or self-serving. But the result was clear. The nuns resisted. And not just with letters. They locked the gates. They barred entry to church officials. They even stationed lay sisters at the walls to deny food deliveries from diocesan sources. The bishop responded by declaring them in spiritual error, which sounds vague until you realize it meant excommunication. That was supposed to break them. It didn't. Instead, they leaned in. Daily prayers were held. Meals continued. Letters flew out to other abbeys seeking support. One nun wrote to a relative in the royal court, another to a sympathetic prior. A third simply wrote poetry verses filled with stubborn hope and veiled defiance. And the community rallied around them. Local villagers began slipping food through the fence. Former novices sent coins hidden in parcels of wool. One elderly monk, furious at the bishop's overreach, sent a handwritten treatise defending their right to self-govern. Eventually, the bishop relented. Not publicly, of course, but quietly. A different confessor was appointed. The grain stores stayed in the sisters' control. No apology came, but no more visits did either. The convent became something of a legend. Other abbeys wrote of the Sisters of the Closed Gate, a phrase that appears in several letters from the period. It wasn't a nickname of scorn, it was one of awe. A fringe detail survives in a marginal doodle from a later scribe, a wimpled figure standing in front of a barred door holding a key in one hand and a feather quill in the other. Beneath it, the inscription, Que scribit regit she who writes rules. This wasn't rebellion for drama. It was quiet, calculated resistance. The sisters understood risk. They understood consequence. But they also understood each other and their shared strength. You watch the bishop depart his retinue, silent, his head low. Behind you, the chapel doors close, not with anger, but with calm finality. The rules have not changed, but now neither have you. The sun is just peeking over the convent wall, casting long golden rays through the cloister's eastern arch. You step out with a small sack, your robe cinched tightly, a staff in hand. It's a pilgrimage, you say, a spiritual journey, a time of reflection. But really, it's something more escape. Not every pilgrimage was an act of piety. For some medieval nuns, these journeys became carefully orchestrated exits, temporary in name only. A chance to slip through the cracks of obedience cloister and male oversight. You walk slowly, at first praying aloud, your feet dusting the road. But as the village disappears and no chaperone calls you back, your pace quickens. You're not just walking to a shrine, you're walking away from something. In theory, pilgrims had to return. The church was clear on that. Convent rules allowed temporary absence for holy sites, Rome, Santiago, even local saints' relics. But many women delayed their return. Some never came back at all. Historians still debate whether this was desertion or divine redirection. Either way, the pattern is clear. One nun visited 3 holy wells in Ireland and ended up living in a mixed community of exiles and anchorites for over a decade. Another disappeared on her way to Canterbury, only to turn up in a London hospital years later, working as a healer under a false name. Then there's the famous case of Sister Beatrix of Brabant, who set out for the tomb of a minor local saint and was found 7 years later running a small chapel in the Alps. Her explanation, I kept going. The church was not amused. Pilgrimages provided plausible cover. They were encouraged, even romanticized. To walk for God was noble. To seek relics was holy. But the truth is, those dirt roads offered something the cloister didn't choice. Some pilgrims traveled in groups, but many nuns went with 1 or 2 companions, trusted sisters who either shared the plan or at least didn't report it. In some cases, a sympathetic prior or abbess may have approved the journey with a knowing nod. After all, once a nun was on the road, there was very little oversight. Fringe detail. Some convents had coded blessings for these pilgrimages. A particular verse from Psalm 91, sung at departure, might mean safe travels to the community, but to the departing sister, it signaled permission not to return. That's not to say these escapes were easy. Women faced danger bandits' illness exposure, and if caught, they could be returned under guard, shamed, or excommunicated. But many judged it worth the risk. Why leave at all? Sometimes it was a yearning for the outside world. Sometimes love real or imagined. Sometimes politics. A nun caught in a disputed inheritance might walk away before being forced into obedience. Others may have sought freedom from spiritual abuses too sensitive to write about abuses historians can only guess at from fragments and implications. And not all who left vanished into the wild. Some wrote letters home explaining their actions. One nun penned a psalm in her own meter, replacing every lord with light and every servant with seeker. It ended. The road is my chapel now. A few became legends. The runaway pilgrim of ruin, the wandering daughter of Girona. Even in cloistered chronicles, their names appear like whispered footnotes, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in warning. You reach a fork in the road now. One path leads to the shrine you're supposedly visiting, the other away into the unknown. You hesitate, but only for a moment. And then you take the second path, the road less sanctified, more uncertain, but entirely your own. The candles are lit in the chapel flickering against the damp stone. You kneel with the others, your lips moving in prayer, your hands folded in reverence. But not everyone here is praying with a clean heart. Some are whispering curses beneath their breath. Some have added herbs to the evening stew. And one sister may be mixing something far more dangerous in the apothecary. Welcome to the shadowed corner of convent resistance, where prayers and poison sometimes shared the same spoon. Let's be clear. The vast majority of nuns lived quiet, devout lives. But every system has its limits, and when pushed too far, even the holy might turn dark. Across Europe, rumors swirled of sisters dabbling in the forbidden, using their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and rituals to strike back at those who oppressed them. Historians still argue whether these acts were real or accusations born from fear. But documents remain court records testimonies, even inquisitorial notes that speak of potions, hexes, and mysterious illnesses that befell inconvenient abbots or overly intrusive confessors. One abbess in Bavaria was accused of laying sorrow upon a bishop's bones, an elegant way of saying she cursed him. Another nun allegedly crafted a powder from foxglove poppy and dried mushroom, which she sprinkled into a visiting prior's wine. He survived, but left the abbey swearing never to return. And then there was the case of Sister Columba in Italy, who brewed soothing draughts that calmed disruptive novices and coincidentally induced visions that conveniently supported her authority. Whether she was a manipulative leader or a spiritual genius remains an open question. The line between healing and harming was razor thin. Nuns were trained herbalists, after all. They knew which plants could ease labor pains and which could stop a heart. When they administered medicine, few questioned it. That trust could be a shield or a weapon. A fringe detail. Some convents kept black books, not demonic grimoires, but coded herbals with ambiguous entries. Saint's leaf for sleeplessness read one line. Beside it, in faded ink, too much brings silence eternal. Who wrote these warnings? Were they meant to caution or to instruct? And then there were the prayers. Most were earnest, of course, but whispers tell of litanies sung backward, of psalms used as veiled threats. One chant from a Spanish convent doubled as an acrostic. Read a certain way, it spelled out, "Deliver us from this man." The man in question. A visiting bishop who died of a sudden fever a week later. Coincidence? Perhaps, but you can't ignore the timing. Sometimes resistance looked like a spoiled loaf left out for a troublesome visitor. Sometimes it was a chalice not quite clean, or a candle that fell just a bit too close to the hem of a disliked superior's robe. Of course, these stories were rarely confirmed. The church was careful not to spread panic. But the fact that such rumors persisted across languages, across centuries, speaks to something deeper fear. And maybe a little awe. Because these weren't brigands or witches in the forest. These were cloistered women wearing linen and chanting psalms. And yet they knew how to make a tincture strong enough to bring sleep forever. You kneel again, your hands still. The prayers continue. The incense curls toward the ceiling, and in the apothecary, a pot simmers quietly. Is it healing, or is it something else? Only the sister stirring it knows for sure. The courtroom isn't what you expected. It's smaller, colder, and packed with men in robes who look everywhere but at you. You are a nun, yes, but you are also a litigant. Today, you're here to challenge a nobleman who's stolen your convent's land. And you didn't come to beg, you came to win. It surprises most people to learn how often medieval nuns went to court. The image of a silent cloistered sister is so fixed in our heads that we forget these women were landowners, employers, and citizens in a deeply legalistic society. And when wronged, they fought back through the legal system with sharp arguments and sharper memory. There's an English record from the 1290s of a prioress who sued a local knight for allowing his pigs to trample the convent's herb garden. She won, citing monastic land rights dating back to a charter granted by Henry II. The knight had to replace the herbs and the fence at his own expense. Not all cases were so quaint. Some nuns sued to reclaim stolen dower lands, challenge inheritance claims, or block abbots from seizing their revenues. In Germany, one entire abbey filed suit against a bishop for unilaterally annexing their vineyards. The sisters presented maps, account books, testimonies. The case dragged on for years, but the final judgment favored them. Historians still debate how much autonomy these women truly had. Some needed male proxies to represent them. Others appeared in court themselves, usually abbesses or prioresses, but occasionally even ordinary sisters, especially in ecclesiastical courts where the rules were looser. There's a recorded case from Paris where a group of Benedictine nuns refused to cede their choir books to a bishop's library. The court sided with the bishop. The sisters refused. The books vanished. Weeks later, a fire destroyed a storehouse on the bishop's land. No one was blamed. But a marginal note in the convent's calendar reads St. Cecilia's Day Victory. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe not. Litigation could also be internal. One nun accused her abbess of misusing funds for personal luxury. Another claimed her spiritual dowry had been redirected without consent. Some of these cases were settled privately. Others went public and messy. You flip through the parchment before you. Your argument is solid. The land in question was donated by a noblewoman whose will is perfectly clear. The opposing family wants it back. They say the donation was made under duress. You say otherwise. Fringe detail. Some convents kept legal training materials in their libraries, summaries, canon law, examples of pleadings, even mock trial transcripts written as teaching tools. These weren't just theological exercises. They were preparation. One abbess in the Rhineland was so renowned for her courtroom skill that local lords asked her to mediate their disputes. She once resolved a border quarrel by drawing a new line with a stick in the mud and declaring it divinely revealed. Both parties agreed, mostly because they feared her pen more than each other's swords. And don't assume these were bitter, vengeful women. Many lawsuits were strategic, not emotional. A way to assert rights, enforce contracts, or simply keep the convent functioning. You stand now. The bailiff nods. The judge looks over his lenses. You speak clearly, calmly, with authority. You do not raise your voice. You do not tremble. Because you are not just a nun. You are an advocate. And today, you are here to remind them that cloistered does not mean silent and vowed does not mean powerless. You're listening in the garden ears, sharpened, head bowed, as if in prayer. A gardener hums nearby. A cart squeaks past on uneven cobbles. And just behind the chapel wall, two voices whisper, Latin phrases not found in any liturgical text. You catch a name, a location, a warning. Welcome to the spy network beneath the cross. It sounds implausible at first. Nuns spies. But dig through the footnotes of medieval correspondence, and you'll find them, women whose cloistered status made them ideal informants. Trusted, hidden, underestimated. Some convents became silent hubs for the transmission of sensitive information. Messages were passed not in code, but in behavior. A ribbon tied in a certain way. A psalm chanted in an unusual order. An extra almond added to a bishop's welcome tray. These were signs not to everyone, but to those who knew what to look for. One Cistercian convent in Burgundy appears in multiple royal records as a place where envoys rested. But rest wasn't the real purpose. Reports suggest that messages were exchanged there between rival factions during a French succession crisis. The sisters provided food and shelter and carried words between men who could not meet. Historians still argue whether these acts were coordinated espionage or improvisational politics. But the pattern is unmistakable. Convents, situated near trade routes or borders, became natural meeting points. Their neutrality and their silence were their shields. One nun in Castile reportedly gathered intelligence about a planned noble rebellion and relayed it to the queen's advisor via a coded letter hidden inside a reliquary box. Another in the Low Countries served as go-between for two warring lords who used her chapel as a message drop. She claimed divine visions had instructed her to intervene. Conveniently, these visions always included details about troop movements, and it wasn't always one side. Some nuns played both. They passed along information to royalists, then turned around and fed updates to rebels. Why? Some out of principle, others for protection. A few perhaps just loved the thrill. One fringe case, a sister named Bruna in the 14th century, who reportedly kept a journal, cataloging conversations overheard from the confessional room, spoken through the screen by visiting priests and soldiers alike. She never used names, but the descriptions were detailed enough to implicate several key players in a regional dispute. Her writings were discovered years later, tucked into a hollowed-out Bible. She had titled it, Things I Was Not Meant to Know. Even the layout of convents lent itself to secrecy, winding corridors, private gardens, multiple entry gates, and layers of public and private spaces. Outsiders rarely saw more than the front parlor. Meanwhile, inside, a sister could speak freely in the scriptorium or infirmary, often with no one the wiser. And let's not forget confession itself. Nuns heard stories, secrets, confessions meant for God, but whispered to a woman behind a screen. While canon law forbade using this information politically, the temptation was real, and some sisters found ways to act on intuition rather than direct knowledge. You close your book now, leaving it open, just a sliver enough for the next set of eyes to read what's tucked between the pages. A map fragment, a date, a single Latin word. Quote, be careful. You rise nod to the gardener and walk back toward the cloister. The message has been delivered. the silence resumes. And somewhere, far beyond the convent walls, history is being nudged quietly and visibly, and by hands no one suspects. The fire crackles low in the corner hearth as you sit copying verses by candlelight. The words blur and blend, but you keep writing. You know your eyes are being watched, not by your sisters, but by those waiting for you to stumble, to say too much, to ask the wrong question, to dream the wrong dream. You're a nun, but tonight you're dangerously close to becoming something else, a heretic. In the medieval world, piety had boundaries, and for women, those boundaries were often lined in barbed wire. A nun could be holy, but too much mysticism, too much leadership, too many visions, and suddenly suspicion bloomed. You weren't just devout, you were unnatural, dangerous, possibly demonic. Historians still debate how much of the heresy charges against nuns were grounded in theology versus control. Some sisters genuinely challenged doctrine. Others were simply inconvenient, outspoken, popular, politically connected. And in an anxious church hierarchy, an inconvenient woman was easily painted as a threat. Take the case of Marguerite Peretti, not a nun in the cloistered sense, but a beguine, a lay religious woman who wrote mystic philosophy. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, argued that divine love could surpass all law. The Inquisition called it heresy. She was burned at the stake in 1310. Copies of her work, however, survived hidden, copied quietly treasured in certain convents. And then there's the story of Sister Alice, a French nun, whose visions began to include criticisms of her abbess, her bishop, and eventually the Pope himself. When confronted, she claimed to speak with the voice of an angel. The bishop claimed she spoke with the devil. She was removed from the convent and sentenced to silent imprisonment. But the line wasn't always clear. Some women used the very language of heresy to push back against male control. Visions of divine correction, warnings of apocalypse if certain abbots weren't replaced. Carefully staged trances during which a sister might reveal heaven's displeasure at the bishop's tax increase. Fringe detail. In several recorded incidents, heretic nuns were defended not by churchmen, but by their communities. Villagers rallied, nobles wrote letters, even rival abbeys offered refuge. One nun, accused of sorcery, was spirited away during a fire drill and taken to a sister convent across the border. And let's not forget the witch trials. While most were aimed at laywomen, a handful of nuns were caught in the net, accused of using relics for spells of casting evil eyes during Mass, or of turning holy water into poison. These accusations rarely stuck in court, but they didn't need to. The damage was done with the rumor alone. Some sisters leaned into the danger. They wore symbols associated with heretics' seven-pointed stars, certain flower motifs within their embroidery. One convent's illumination of the Virgin Mary included strange background figures resembling banned mystics. Coincidence, perhaps, but the timing is provocative. And sometimes, silence was the boldest act. Refusing to confess to charges, refusing to renounce dreams. One nun's final words before removal were recorded as, "If I am wrong, let God speak to me himself." You dip your pen in ink and continue copying, carefully, precisely. But you slip in one line from a forbidden text translated into a phrase no one will catch unless they've read the same book. You are not a heretic, But you are not tame either. You are something the church can't quite name, and that's exactly how you like it. It's the middle of a stormy night, and the convent is hushed except for one cell where Sister Johanna is weeping, or praying, or both. She's had another vision. One, she says, came straight from St. Catherine, and this one, it's going to change things. Welcome to the strange, strategic world of miracle making, where divine intervention was occasionally curated. It's no secret that miracles held power. Visions, healings, bleeding relics. These events could boost a convent's prestige, draw donations, protect property, and ward off meddling bishops. So, it's perhaps no surprise that in some places miracles were subtly, how shall we say, encouraged. You might imagine this as pure deception, but it was often far more complicated. A sister sees a light, or thinks she does. A novice dreams of a voice. The abbess, seeing opportunity, interprets it as a sign. A pattern emerges. A relic starts weeping, perhaps aided by a little oil. Pilgrims arrive. Offerings pile up. And suddenly, the convent can afford a new roof. Historians still argue about intent. Were these women consciously fabricating events? Or did their belief run so deep that suggestion became reality? Either way, miracles became tools, and tools in skilled hands build power. One of the most famous examples comes from a convent in Bohemia, where a statue of the Virgin was said to blink during Mass. Sisters claimed it was a sign of divine approval. Skeptics whispered about candle soot and clever timing. Still, the miracle drew hundreds. And when the bishop tried to install a new confessor, the sisters cited the blinking statue as proof that the Virgin had already chosen. It worked. The bishop backed down. Then there was the abbess, who reportedly saw visions of fire consuming the chapel if the convent's land was taken. She told this to visiting nobles who relayed it to the local court. The land grant was quietly withdrawn. No fire ever came. But the fear lingered. Fringe detail. One convent embroidered their vision scrolls with gold thread and tiny gems, turning prophetic messages into literal treasure. Whether or not the visions were genuine, the scrolls were stunning. They survive today in museums, still gleaming with sacred suggestion. Sometimes the miracle wasn't a vision, but a performance. A sister would enter ecstatic trance during evening prayers. Her voice would change, her eyes would roll. She'd speak in rhyme or Latin she shouldn't know. This could go on for hours until suddenly she would wake with a message. Change your ways, pay the convent, remove the new tax. And sometimes it wasn't a sister at all. A relic would bleed or glow. A candle would relight itself. One nun claimed her inkpot refilled by divine hand. Another said the bells rang on their own to mark a holy day. Skeptics were warned not to doubt the divine. Of course, not every convent played these games. Many were sincerely devout. But when times were hard, and men in robes threatened what the sisters had built, a well-timed miracle could work wonders. You kneel beside Sister Johanna now. She's still shaking. You hand her a cloth press, her hand gently, and whisper, "Write it down, every word." Whether she saw something or not is irrelevant. The vision is real because you've chosen to believe it or chosen to use it. And tomorrow, when the bishop arrives, the scroll will be waiting on his chair. signed not by Johanna, but by heaven itself. You stand in the doorway of the novice hall, watching a new arrival lower her hood. She's young, perhaps 15, but carries herself like someone used to being served, not taught. Her hands are pale, her eyes are sharp, and the abbess greets her with a formality that says this is no ordinary girl. This is a secret daughter. In medieval Europe, noble families often placed their illegitimate daughters in convents, not out of devotion, but strategy. A hidden child was a political liability in court, but a cloistered one could become an asset, a loyal voice within the church, a buffer against rival claims, even a backup alliance. For the convent, accepting such girls came with benefits, generous dowries, land grants, legal protections. But it also came with complexity. These daughters arrived with secrets, and sometimes with agendas. Historians still debate how much autonomy these girls truly had. Were they pawns or players? For some, the convent was a prison. For others, it was a new seat of power. One record from a Burgundian abbey mentions a girl known only as Domina M, whose dowry included enough land to double the convent's income. Within a year, she was managing correspondence. Within 2, she was overseeing disputes. By 20, she was acting as de facto prioress. When the legitimate heir to her father's estate died suddenly, she quietly sponsored a lawsuit claiming her own blood right and won, and she was far from alone. Some of these daughters were placed deliberately near rival noble territories where they could observe, report, or influence local clergy. Others were meant to stay invisible, but used their literacy, education, and name to gain influence within church hierarchies. One particularly bold nun forged a letter suggesting her half-brother, now a duke, had promised to fund a new chapel. When he refused, she sent the letter to the bishop, and the funding arrived 2 months later. Fringe detail. Certain convents kept special chambers for gifted novices, better heated, more privacy, sometimes even personal chaplains. The official reason, health and devotion. The real reason, politics. These daughters knew things, knew how the court moved, how alliances were bartered, how nobles smiled when they meant to threaten. And they brought that knowledge inside the cloister. Some shared it willingly, strengthening the sisterhood. Others kept to themselves, playing long games that no one fully understood, until years later, when a political shift suddenly benefited the abbey, or a suspiciously timed death left the convent richer and better protected. Of course, it wasn't all cunning. Many of these girls struggled, torn between 2 worlds, forced into vows they didn't choose. Some ran, some broke down. A few, tragically, were removed under grim circumstances. But those who stayed, those who adapted, became something powerful. Not just nuns, not just daughters, but silent strategists. You watch the new girl now as she walks down the hall. She pauses, noticing an embroidered banner. A rose, a hawk, a star. Symbols that mean little to outsiders, but to her, perhaps they mean everything. She touches the edge of the cloth and nods just slightly. She understands. You rise before dawn one last time. The bells haven't rung yet, but you don't need them anymore. The rhythm is in your bones. As you move through the corridor, you pass the faces you've come to know. The novice with ink on her fingers, the gardener who sings to the herbs, the old sister who still sews messages into hymns even though her eyesight's nearly gone. You've walked through secrets, through rebellion, through prayers spoken and unspoken. And now you're standing at the edge of something larger, a legacy. Historians don't write about these women often. They didn't start wars. They didn't build empires, but they reshaped the world all the same, quietly, stubbornly, with candlelight and conviction. One forbidden text preserved. One unjust order ignored. One girl smuggled out under the guise of pilgrimage. Each act, small on its own, added up. Like stitches in a tapestry, they wove a different history, one where women didn't just endure the system. They rewrote it. You walk into the scriptorium. The desk is empty, save for a single scroll tied with red thread. A new rule, perhaps, or an old one revised. You untie it and begin to read, not with surprise, but with understanding. This is how change happens here, slowly, purposefully, and always under the veil of sacred duty. Fringe detail. In the margins of some convent manuscripts, modern scholars have found faint notations, Latin words scratched beside verses vidi, scripsi, tacui, I saw, I wrote, I kept silent. They weren't claims, they were promises. The world outside moved on. Kings crowned cities, burned, borders shifted. But inside these walls, the sisters remembered, passed down names, stories, symbols. A lock of hair hidden in a book, a recipe coded into chant notation, a blessing said a little differently. And over centuries, those quiet acts form the foundation of what some now call feminist theology. The belief that the divine can be female, that obedience can be questioned, that silence, too, can be a kind of voice. You kneel for the last time, but this time not in submission, in gratitude. Not because someone told you to, but because you choose to. The chapel is empty, but filled with echoes of laughter, of defiance, of footsteps heading off on pilgrimages that never circled back. You rise, you turn, you walk forward, not out of rebellion now, but inheritance. These women changed everything. They were never loud, but they were never truly silent either. So now, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, picture those stone halls one more time. The cool flagstones beneath your feet. The faint scent of beeswax and lavender oil in the chapel. The soft, rhythmic clack of needles in the embroidery room. Imagine the low hum of evening chants echoing through the cloister, layered with the secrets they stitched into every fold of linen and every whispered prayer. Hear the rustle of parchment as another letter is sealed, slipped under a door, or hidden in a hymnal bound not for heaven, but for the world beyond. Let those candlelit scenes linger a little longer. The steady voice of the abbess reading a letter from the Pope she may or may not have forged. The smile exchanged between two sisters in the garden as a coded blessing passes between them like a benediction. You're not in that world anymore, but part of it remains. In the quiet strength of those who resist, in the silent wisdom of those who endure, in the knowledge that sometimes the most lasting revolutions are the ones no one notices until they've already changed everything. Rest easy now. Let the stone walls fade, the bells fall silent, the candle gutter to darkness. You're safe, you're warm, and the story woven in thread, sung in Latin buried in margins, is still being written. If this story surprised you or made you feel something, don't scroll away. Leave a comment, share it with someone curious like you, and hit that subscribe button. More secrets, more forbidden tales are coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.